Welcome to our deep dive into Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. We're not going to go chapter by chapter or anything, but we will be pulling out some of the most fascinating ideas from this book.
It really is a book that completely changed how we think about the natural world.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think that his ideas from so long ago are still shaping scientific thought today.
Absolutely.
So Darwin starts with something that actually feels surprisingly familiar to us now. Breeding, like domesticated animals. And he was particularly fascinated by pigeons.
Yeah, pigeon breeding was like this huge craze in Victorian England. And Darwin saw it as like a microcosm of evolution in a way. He noticed this incredible diversity that pigeon breeders created, and all of it was stemming from a single ancestor, the rock pigeon.
Yeah, and the variety really is kind of incredible. Like you have these pigeons with chests all puffed out like balloons, others that are doing somersaults in the air, some with tails like intricate lace fans. Why pigeons, though? What was it about this that grabbed Darwin's attention?
He was really struck by how artificial selection, like how humans, over just a few generations, could result in these dramatic variations.
Yeah.
So if humans could do that, imagine what nature could accomplish over millions of years.
Right.
And that's really where the idea of natural selection comes in.
Okay, so there's this vast time scale that we have to try to wrap our heads around. But before even getting to natural selection, Darwin introduces this concept of a struggle for existence.
Right.
Can you kind of unpack that a bit?
Yeah, so it's not always like these dramatic battles for survival you see on nature shows.
Huh.
It's more about the competition for resources,
Yeah.
food, mates, even just like space to live. Darwin tells this really interesting story about Scotch firs on a heath in England. When they enclosed the area and cattle couldn't graze there anymore, the whole landscape totally changed.
So it wasn't like planting trees that made the difference. It was the lack of the cows eating them that allowed them to flourish.
Exactly. That's a really good example of how limited resources create competition, which in turn gives a leg up to those with even the slightest advantage.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've got all this variation out there in the world and this constant struggle for resources. How does that lead to natural selection?
So natural selection is like nature's editor. It's constantly refining these populations by favoring individuals that are best suited to their environment. So think about wolves, for instance. A wolf that's even slightly faster than its pack mates might be more successful at hunting, especially if food is scarce.
Meaning it's more likely to survive, have pups, and pass on that speed advantage.
Right.
That subtle difference over many generations can really reshape the whole species.
Yeah,
But this must take an incredibly long time.
that's where it gets really mind-blowing. Darwin argues that even very complex organs, like the eye, could evolve through this gradual process over countless generations. It's almost like building a really complex machine, but just making these tiny improvements over time.
Right.
Each small change might not seem significant on its own, but over these vast stretches of time, the results can be astonishing.
Yeah, definitely. Now, as populations adapt to different environments, they start to drift apart, right? That's where this idea of divergence comes in.
Precisely. Darwin uses a really vivid example from cattle breeding in Yorkshire. The shorthorn cattle, they totally outcompeted the longhorn cattle, replaced them almost completely. He even compares it to a murderous pestilence sweeping through the region.
Wow.
Dramatic but effective imagery.
It really does underscore how this process can reshape entire ecosystems. And isn't that process of divergence and competition what eventually leads to new species?
That's a key part of the puzzle. Darwin imagined this branching pattern of lineages, which we now represent as the tree of life metaphor.
Huh.
As these populations diverge and they adapt to different niches, they become increasingly distinct. And eventually those differences become so significant that the isolated groups, they can't interbreed anymore. And that's when you can say a new species has emerged.
Right. But if evolution is this gradual process, shouldn't we see tons of transitional forms in the fossil record? That seems like that would have been a big challenge for Darwin.
Absolutely. Darwin was very aware of the missing links argument, but he countered it by emphasizing the vastness of geologic time and the fact that the fossil record is inherently incomplete.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom the immensity of geologic time.
Right.
Trying to grasp those timescales makes you feel pretty insignificant.
Exactly. Fossilization itself is a rare occurrence.
Yeah.
The conditions have to be just right. So we're only working with this limited and fragmented record. But even with those gaps, the fossil evidence that we do have still reveals this compelling pattern of change over time.
And it's not just fossils, right? Darwin found further evidence for his theories by looking at how species are spread out across the globe. He seemed particularly intrigued by these remote islands, like the Galapagos.
Ah, the Galapagos finches. Classic example. Each island has these slightly different finches, and their beaks are perfectly adapted to their specific food sources. It's like nature's own experiment in adaptation and speciation.
So, isolation, migration, and adaptation all playing a role in this grand scheme. Each island is like this little evolutionary laboratory, and the results are fascinating. We're really starting to see the power of Darwin's ideas here.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Darwin explores so many other intriguing aspects of evolution, through the development of instincts to the complexities of social insects.
There's definitely a lot more to uncover. We'll delve into those intricate details in part 2 of our deep dives. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
Well, yes.
Last time we were exploring some of the foundations of natural selection, variation, the struggle for existence, and how that leads to the divergence of species. Yeah, we also touched on how the fossil record and the geographic distribution of species, how that supports these ideas. But Darwin doesn't stop there. He goes on to tackle some really fascinating, complex aspects of evolution, like the development of instincts.
Yeah, instincts.
Yeah.
Those behaviors that seem almost hardwired.
Right.
Like a bird knowing how to build a nest or a spider spinning its web, it just knows how to do it.
Exactly. Darwin argues that instincts, just like physical traits, they're shaped by natural selection. So
Yeah.
over generations, those behaviors that increase an individual's chances of survival and reproduction, those become more and more common. It's easy to see how this might work for something like nest building, right?
Right. A slightly better nest design might lead to more chicks surviving, which means those nest building genes are more likely to get passed on. Makes sense. But what about instincts that seem, well, a bit bizarre? Darwin talks about parasitic bees
Oh, yeah.
that lay their eggs in other bees' nests. That's so strange.
That's a great example. He also uses the cuckoo, that bird that like abandons its eggs to be raised by another species. Right.
It seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense.
So if a cuckoo can trick another bird into raising its chicks, it frees up the cuckoo to lay more eggs and potentially have more offspring.
Exactly.
Sneaky, but effective. But how could such a seemingly selfish behavior evolve through natural selection? It seems like that would be selected against.
Yeah, it's a good question. Darwin argues that even these seemingly selfish behaviors can be favored by natural selection as long as they ultimately increase the individual's chances of reproductive success. So it's all about passing on those genes to the next generation one way or another.
He also discusses slave-making ants, which is just nuts to think about. They steal the pupa of other ants to raise them as their own workforce. It's like these ants are waging tiny wars to build their own labor force. It's wild, right? Slave-making ants are this remarkable example of how even complex social behaviors can evolve. Darwin was fascinated by the variations in slave-making behavior between different ant species, which suggests that even intricate instincts can be modified over time through evolution.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think of those tiny creatures exhibiting such complex behaviors. And speaking of complex behavior, Darwin spends a lot of time on one of nature's most impressive architects, the hive bee.
Right? The honeybee, with its incredibly efficient hexagonal honeycomb cells.
It's amazing.
It totally captivated Darwin's attention. He was like, how on earth do bees, with their seemingly simple brains, how could they possibly construct such precise and intricate structures?
Yeah, and he didn't just observe them, did he? I seem to remember reading that Darwin actually conducted experiments with honeycombs,
Yeah.
like building them and stuff.
You're right, he did. He would use colored wax to observe how the bees built their cells, meticulously documenting their behavior. Yeah, through those experiments and observations, he was able to conclude that even something as complex as honeycomb construction could have arisen through a series of small incremental changes, just like anything else.
So starting with a simple rounded cell, natural selection would have favored those bees that built slightly more efficient shapes, leading to the perfect hexagon we see today. It's fascinating to think about how much information and evolutionary history is packed into that honeycomb structure.
Yeah, definitely. And this leads us to one of the most challenging ideas that Darwin grapples with. The evolution of sterile castes in social insects. So think about worker bees, for example.
Okay.
They dedicate their entire lives to the hive, but they never reproduce themselves.
Right. It seems like a dead end from an evolutionary perspective. If they're not passing on their genes, how could their self-sacrificing behavior evolve?
Yeah, that was a major puzzle for Darwin.
Mm.
But he eventually realized that the key is to look at selection not just at the level of the individual, but at the level of the colony as a whole.
Oh, okay. So if a colony with more efficient sterile workers is more successful overall, those genes for sterility, though not directly passed on by the workers themselves, will still spread through the queen's offspring.
Exactly. It's called kin selection.
Oh,
It's
okay.
a really fascinating concept, and it explains how seemingly altruistic behaviors can actually be favored by natural selection. Darwin admitted that this was one of the most difficult challenges to his theory, but he saw this case of sterile insects as further evidence for the power of natural selection.
It's a testament to his scientific rigor that he didn't shy away from the tough questions. But this all begs the question, how do new species actually arise? How do we get from this variation within a population to distinct separate species?
Well, Darwin devotes a lot of space to that question. He argues that isolation plays a crucial role. So when populations are geographically separated, say by a mountain range or a large body of water, they evolve independently, adapting to their unique environments.
Like those Galapagos finches again. Isolated on different islands, they've evolved these distinct beak shapes adapted to the specific foods available on their island.
Exactly. Oceanic islands, in particular, are like natural laboratories for observing this process.
Right.
They often have fewer species than continents, but many of those species are endemic, meaning they're found nowhere else on Earth.
So, endemic species have evolved in isolation, leading to unique adaptations and ultimately new species. It makes those islands incredibly valuable from a biodiversity perspective. But Darwin also noticed that these islands often lack entire groups of organisms that are common on continents, like amphibians and land mammals.
That's right. And he realized that the ability to disperse across geographical barriers plays this huge role in which species are found where. Oceanic islands, for example, are really difficult to colonize, especially for those creatures that can't fly or swim very long distances.
Yeah, it's like this incredible game of chance with only a few lucky pioneers managing to make the journey. But here's what I find truly mind-boggling. Even on these isolated islands, the species that do exist are often related to those found on the nearest mainland.
Exactly. This suggests that they descended from mainland ancestors that somehow managed to make the journey across the ocean, and then they evolved in new directions once they arrived.
Amazing. He considered all sorts of methods of dispersal, right? Like birds carrying seeds in their guts, driftwood carrying insects across the ocean, even like snails hitching rides on floating vegetation.
Yeah, he really did consider it all.
Yeah.
It highlights this incredible resilience of life and these surprising ways that organisms can disperse across the globe. And once those pioneering individuals reach a new environment, they become the founders of new lineages, shaped by the forces of natural selection.
That's amazing. And this idea of isolation and divergence applies to continents as well, right?
Absolutely.
We see a lot of diversity within continents shaped by mountain ranges, deserts, and other geographical barriers.
Exactly. All of those geographical features act as barriers to gene flow, allowing populations to evolve independently. As those variations accumulate over time, eventually those isolated populations reach a point where they can no longer interbreed, and we can say that a new species has emerged.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that these seemingly insurmountable barriers can actually drive the engine of evolution, leading to this incredible diversity we see on our planet. But Darwin doesn't just focus on the positive aspects, does he?
That's right. He also grapples with the reality of extinction. It's kind of a sobering reminder that this evolutionary road is littered with the remnants of species that couldn't adapt to changing environments.
Darwin paints a pretty stark picture of this struggle for existence. It's not all sunshine and roses. There's competition, there's loss, and ultimately there's the risk of extinction for any species that can't keep up. We'll explore those darker aspects of evolution and Darwin's thoughts on those in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into On the Origin of Species. We've explored some pretty fascinating ideas over the last two parts, like the intricate workings of natural selection.
Yeah, and the complex behaviors of social insects.
And we ended last time talking about the darker side of evolution, extinction.
Right.
Kind of a sobering thought, the idea that countless lineages have just vanished from Earth.
Extinction is an inescapable reality of evolution, unfortunately. It's a natural process that's been happening for billions of years.
Right.
But Darwin also recognized that human activities can accelerate extinction,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
sometimes with devastating consequences.
Yeah, he saw firsthand the impact of introduced species on native populations.
And he understood the destructive potential of habitat loss. In many ways, Darwin's observations foreshadow the biodiversity crisis we're facing today.
Definitely. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to understand the impact of our actions on the natural world
Yeah.
and to try to mitigate those impacts whenever possible.
Yeah.
But even as species vanish, new ones emerge, right?
Right.
This tree of life is constantly growing and changing.
And it's that image of the tree of life that really captures the grand sweep of Darwin's vision. It's this idea that all living things are connected,
Yeah.
sharing a common ancestry that stretches back to the very beginnings of life on Earth.
Darwin saw that branching pattern of the tree of life as evidence for common descent. Each branch represents a lineage that has diverged and evolved over time, adapting to the unique challenges of its environment.
It's a beautiful and powerful metaphor, but it also raises some challenging questions. For example, how do we reconcile this idea of gradual evolution with the fossil record, which sometimes seems to show these sudden leaps and the appearance of whole new groups of organisms all at once?
Yeah, Darwin grappled with this issue as well. He acknowledged that the fossil record is inherently incomplete. It's like trying to reconstruct this vast library from just a handful of scattered pages.
Right.
We're missing huge chunks of information, and the pieces we do have are often fragmented and difficult to interpret.
So those gaps in the fossil record can create the illusion of sudden jumps, when in reality the transitions might have been happening gradually over very long periods of time.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the fossil record is biased towards organisms with hard parts, like shells, bones, and teeth. Soft-bodied creatures are much less likely to fossilize.
Yeah.
So we're getting kind of a skewed picture of past life.
It's like trying to understand a forest ecosystem by only looking at the trees. You're missing that whole understory of plants and fungi and insects and all the other organisms that make up this complex web of life.
Darwin argued that even with its limitations, the fossil record still supports his theory, the overall pattern we see, the increasing complexity of life over time, the emergence of new groups, the extinction of others. All of this points towards evolution as the driving force.
It's a reminder that science is a process of constantly refining our understanding. We have to be willing to acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge and revise our theories as new evidence emerges.
Throughout On the Origin of Species, Darwin weaves together all of this evidence from all these different fields, from the breeding of domesticated animals to the geographic distribution of species to these really intricate details of anatomy and embryology.
Yeah.
He builds this really compelling case for his theory. But he doesn't shy away from addressing potential objections.
He's very upfront about the challenges to his ideas, which makes his arguments even more persuasive. It's clear that he's thought deeply about these issues, and he's confident in the strength of his theory.
Yeah, his work was truly revolutionary. It transformed our understanding of the natural world, and his ideas continue to shape scientific thought today.
On the Origin of Species is a challenging book, but it's also incredibly rewarding. It's packed with fascinating observations, bold ideas, and this real sense of awe and wonder at the complexity and beauty of life on Earth.
Darwin concludes his book with this really powerful statement about the grandeur in this view of life.
Yeah.
It's humbling and inspiring to recognize our place in this vast evolutionary tapestry.
As descendants of this long line of ancestors stretching back billions of years.
Right.
Yeah, it's a perspective that can change the way we see ourselves and our place in the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious, what has Darwin's work left you pondering? What questions has it sparked for you?
We hope this exploration has given you a deeper appreciation for the elegance and power of evolution and the enduring legacy of Darwin's groundbreaking ideas.